Welcome all. We have a wonderful program tonight with Pico Iyer. I think all of you know Pico, but Pico has been one of the great storytellers of our times. He's written an awful lot about travel. He travels the world. He's been to God knows how many countries over God knows how many years. But every year and every season, he returns to a monastery in Big Sur, a Benedictine monastery high on the hill in Big Sur overlooking the Pacific. And he's written thousands of pages of notes in the 32 years and the more than 100 visits he's made to that hermitage. And he gathered that into this book. It's called Aflame, Learning from Silence. As you can see, my copy is already well worn. And I highly recommend that you get the book and read it. And we're so lucky to have Pico here tonight to speak to us about Aflame and about silence and about some of the other topics. So welcome, Pico. Thank you for coming.
Thank you. I'm so really happy to be back with you, John, and with your community.
I think we were going to start with a reading. Probably you were going to start and just lead off with your book. Would that be possible?
More than possible. Yeah,
Okay.
I'd be happy to do that. Why don't I just read the first page and a half of this book?
Absolutely, yeah.
It's both topical and it probably sets up some of the central tensions of the book. Two men in white robes stand at the end of the road, high above the empty highway. That fire last October, says one, young and slim, his eyes burning under his shaven head. It came within 3 miles of us. At one point, our road got blocked and there was no way out. It was radiant. His older monastic brother says nothing. For 3 days and nights, Cyprian goes on, the sky was black, like sooty fog all the time. I went down to the last bench and the whole ocean was blood red. Plumes of smoke were rising from the hills. I heard trees exploding. It was incandescent. I don't know what to say. Fire has already left its mark on me. You pay for your blessings, I venture at last. We do, says the other, burly, with gentle eyes. A lot of people don't understand that. They only see the beauty. The beauty, of course, is hard to miss. In the distance, headlands stretch towards the cities to the south, surf scribbling white around their edges. To our right, a wide expanse of ocean with not a thing to interrupt the blue. A deep valley to our left, and the golden hills from which lions sometimes emerge or their prey. 900 acres of live oak, madrona, redwood, and desert yucca, a quarter of a mile above the sea. I wonder if beauty always has to carry a trace of mortality, I try. And my two friends are wise enough not to say a word, looking out over the charred hills to the promise all around. And I guess, I start the book with that because fire sits at the heart of it, but I think it's probably an appropriate place to begin tonight because I'm guessing many of you live near the dry hills of California or other dry hills where your most loyal and constant visitor is fire.
We do. In my own family, 3 of my family members have been directly affected by fire, and we had a fire in 2019 sweep over our property and burned almost all the houses in the neighborhood, and it was totally destroyed. I don't know if we'll have time to talk about this, but I recently wrote a note about how the recovery from that fire has been dramatic, and so there is hope. There is hope once these fires pass through. But I wanted to ask you, Pico, about your background. You grew up in England. You were son of scholars. You went to, I think, a Christian grammar school, and then you went to college at Oxford, and then you came to Cambridge and went to college. And so you've been very much in an academic world, and you were probably had one of the most desirable jobs in all of journalism, which was working for Time magazine, writing essays. And you gave all that up at age 27.
Yes, I'm partly because I've been lucky enough to read Henry David Thoreau as soon as I arrived in this country, and was really touched by his saying he didn't want to die, feeling he had never lived. And partly because, as you probably know, John, I had a 20-hour layover near Narita Airport in Tokyo on my way back to New York City from Hong Kong. And walking around that airport town, I felt such a piercing sense of recognition. I thought, if I don't come back here, I will be in exile for life. And of course, in your 20s, I didn't have any dependents. I had few responsibilities. It wasn't very hard to take the plunge. But I felt so long as I stayed in New York, I would always be thinking, what might it be like to live in Japan? And the minute I arrived in Japan, I never entertained the thought of living anywhere else.
That's great. And you write also that your idea in coming back to Japan was probably to become a monk in a Zen temple. And we'll talk about that in a second, if that's okay. But first, I wanted to maybe introduce the Hermitage, which is so central to your story. And with just a quick reading, if that's okay. This is a transcription from something, a talk you gave 10 years ago, I guess we were talking about. And you say somehow this was the first time, I believe, that you came to the Hermitage, which is in Big Sur. It's about what, 2.5, 3 hours north of you in Santa Barbara.
Hmm.
Somehow, almost immediately, it was if a huge heaviness fell away from me and the lens cap came off my eyes. Suddenly, I was seeing everything with immediacy. And it was almost as if little Pico had disappeared and the whole world had come into me instead. I remember a blue jay suddenly alighted on the fence outside my window, and I watched it rapt as if it was the most miraculous thing that had happened. Then bells began ringing above, and it felt like they were ringing inside of me. Then, when darkness fell, I just walked along the monastery road under the stars, watching the taillights of cars disappear around the headlands to the south. And really, almost instantaneously, I felt I'd stepped into a richer, deeper life, a real life that I had half forgotten had existed.
And so, embarrassingly, after 10 years, there's nothing I would change about that. You know, Thomas Merton, the great caretaker of silence, living 27 years as in his Trappist monastery, said, when the mind is silent, then the forest suddenly becomes magnificently real. So that's a much more concise and eloquent way of putting it. As soon as you're out of your head and back in your senses, you're freed of yourself and your chatter. Every Zen meditator knows that. And you're back in the heart of the real world, and therefore it seems to be a realer self. And to go back, if I may, to what you were saying a minute ago, when I left New York City with the high minded ambition of living in a Zen temple in Kyoto for a year, it was precisely because I knew nothing about a Zen temple. And it was entirely a romance. You know, I only imagined sitting on a wooden platform under the full moon writing a haiku. And so, as soon as I arrived, I was stripped of my illusions and had to rethink my plans. But when I went to the Benedictine Hermitage, I think my one advantage I had is that the last thing I ever wanted to go to was a Benedictine Hermitage. As you said, I'd been through 15 years of rigorous Anglican schooling, chapel every morning, chapel every evening, the Lord's Prayer in Latin on Sundays, the Gospel according to Matthew in Greek in the daytime. So really, that tradition had no appeal to me. But my house burnt down. I was sleeping on the floor. I had nothing in the world to carry except a toothbrush. And suddenly the notion of a quiet room above the Pacific Ocean where I'd have a bed and a desk and food and showers, all for $30 a night, became appealing. So in retrospect, I think, of course, as Zen practitioners, you know, the fact I had no expectations and went almost against my will through force of necessity and circumstance to that hermitage, it was the best possible introduction. And it's exactly the fact that I went with various designs and agendas to the Zen temple that meant it wouldn't work for them.
That's great. And you got to know the monks very, very well. And interestingly, as the years went on and they got to know you and feel closer to you, they invited you inside their walls. And I see that separation, the wall of what you call the boiler room, I think, the wall as the inside and the outside, almost the quiet and the fire, these two contrasts in life. Could you tell us a little bit about the community there and about inside the boiler room?
Yes, they are living in the midst of fire. So they belong to the Camaldolese congregation, which is the most contemplative order within the Catholic Church. And in fact, they've been told by the Vatican to interact with other religious traditions as much as possible, in honor of Vatican II saying nothing that is true or holy is inimical to us. We need to learn from any tradition that offers those two things. And so the longtime prior would teach at Tassajara Zen Center across the hills. When you step into your little cell and you read the literature about the place, they say on the first page, well, of course, the Buddha was the father of monasticism. They quote the Rig Veda. And they actually have a Catholic Hindu ashram in southern India where the priest wears a dhoti and eats with his hands and sleeps on the floor. And the motto for that ashram is, "We are here to awaken from the illusion of separateness." And if I'd been a little more alert when I talked to Krista Tippett, I would have said, well, the two reasons I go there, first to wake up, and secondly to get past the illusion of separateness. So once little Pico and his designs are out of the picture, suddenly there's no division between inner and outer, as in that section about the bells. And so I've always loved that notion of awakening from the illusion of separateness. But I was even more admiring of my monk friends when I found out it comes from Thich Nhat Hanh, a Vietnamese Buddhist, and touched that Benedictine monks would be wise and open enough to take as their central dictum the words of Thich Nhat Hanh. So I suppose the biggest surprise for me and the beauty of freeing myself from preconceptions there was that these monks are much less dogmatic than I or most of my friends are. And as you say, I'm not a Christian. And they not only open their doors and hearts to me, but as you said, allow me to stay with them for long periods. And there was another person in their cloister who was training to be a rabbi. There are many Buddhists there. So they're entirely about living in the world beyond divisions. That said, the wall, as you said, is a precise division insofar as those of us who go on retreat are in this radiant silence with not a care in the world, partly because the monks are working night and day to take care of us as well as to look after each other. So as soon as you're in the cloister, they're wearing blue work clothes, and some of them are planting vegetables, and others are doing accounts, and others are going shopping, and others are preparing the meals for everybody to eat. It's a very tough office setting in which, like all monastics, they are living with 20 other people, 10 of whom they might never have wanted to spend an evening with, and they're committed to living with those people for life. They're married to 20 individuals, maybe 10 of whom they find annoying, which is a humbling and inspiring spectacle. And then on the other side, it's just people like me when I'm a retreatant, walking on air and freed from the chatter and stress of the daily world.
Their life as mendicants, cloistered, is pretty strict, though, isn't it? You have several examples of, for example, one of the monks came and said that maybe it was Thomas, what do they call it, the prelate, or the chief monk had told him, you have to forget your family, you have to forget all your ideas, you have to give up everything. And another said he had to go back home and die to his former life and then come back. So there's just a sense of sort of complete I don't know, giving up any regard for the outside world, right? Or
Absolute surrender. They die before
absolute
they die,
surrender. Yeah, yeah.
as the Sufis say. Exactly. So sometimes I'm visiting there, and there's a torrential winter storm, and the rain beats on the roof all night, and the wind shakes the flimsy foundations of this little wooden trailer. And I look outside, I can't see a single light or sign of human habitation. It's terrifying and lonely. It's really like 40 days in the wilderness, it feels. And then I realized that the monks, as you were suggesting, live in their little cells on intimate terms with doubt and fear and frustration. And there's nowhere for them to escape, nowhere for them to run. And they have made a commitment to living in the wilderness for the rest of their lives. I remember Edo Roshi said a Zen monk is somebody who moves his cushion closer to the precipice. And I feel that that's what they're doing. They're living on the edge of the abyss, not just in terms of proximity to fire and remoteness from comfort, but as you say, psychologically. And I was very touched when I completed my manuscript, because I didn't want to presume upon their anonymity or get things wrong. I sent the manuscript to two of the monks I'd described, including the one who came to my trailer and expressed some of his frustrations with the life. And I said, please, if there's anything you'd like me to take out, I will. And both of them instantly said no. And the one whose secrets I thought I was betraying said, our brokenness is our main gift to humanity. It's the fact that we're mortal and fallible and not above the clouds that is what we have to share with others. So I was very, very touched by that, and that in that sense they have nothing to hide. And the sort of thing I feel I could learn from.
Yeah, yeah. And fire inside, fire outside. And one of them said, the longing itself is the ecstasy, right? Just this longing for, I don't know, what are they longing for, do you think?
Closeness to their God, I think, which they know by definition, since they're living among fellow mortals, is never going to be complete. And one of the touching things I found, probably already, having grown up close to this tradition, is that quite a few of them, like Mother Teresa, join the community and die to their previous lives because they have an intimation or an engagement with God. And then they go to the cell and he never appears again. Hic Deus absconditus. He's an absence for the rest of their lives. And so that's really, really hard. That's like marrying a woman who then leaves the room and you never see her once more. So even as I exult in the joy and freedom they offer their visitors, I never want to underestimate the challenges that they go through. And I love what you said about fire, because of course, the Buddha said all the world is a house on fire. And most everyone in this community probably knows the fire sermon. Thomas Merton said everything must burn. And yet they have to keep the fires of confidence and hope and conviction alive, even as the external fires are rewriting their lives constantly. Because in the remote wilderness, in high above the ocean, as you said, flames are always surging over the ridge and coming right towards them. And so they have to face the question that I think is a central question before most of us these days, whether it's pandemic or fire or hurricane or tsunami or earthquake or typhoon, how remain calm in the face of uncertainty, and how sustain hope in the middle of impermanence? I mean, I suppose that's a great Buddhist question too, that they live it out so intimately. It's startling to see. And you've read the book, so there's one moment when, not so long ago, another fire has sent most of the monks running, and three stay behind to help the firefighters try to protect their house. And the prior sends out daily updates to friends like myself. And one day he says there's smoke everywhere, and we can see the walls of orange rising above the ridge behind us, maybe 200 yards away. But don't worry, we're maintaining our offices, we're doing vespers and vigils and matins. Blessed day all. Blessed day all, he says, when it looks as if he's going to lose perhaps his life and everything he knows and loves.
Well, you yourself lost everything in your house, and could you just review for us that story a little bit? You've written about it a fair amount, but I think it's so important because it was sort of an inflection point in your writing career, from what I can see.
Yes, and fire as a metaphor became something that I would return to again and again in my writing. So yes, I was in my family home here in the hills of Santa Barbara, and I saw this distant knife of orange cutting through a hillside. So I called the fire department, and then when I came upstairs again, it was to see that our whole house was encircled by 70-foot flames, 5 stories high. So I grabbed my mother's cat, jumped into a car, drove down our little driveway, and when I came to our narrow mountain road, I saw I couldn't go up and I couldn't go down. The smoke was so thick that we could hear helicopters above, but we couldn't see them and they couldn't see us. and the fire was so intense that no fire truck could come up to help us. And the only thing that saved us was a good Samaritan who'd been driving along the 101 freeway, saw a fire break out in the hills, drove up because he had a water truck, and by complete chance ended up stranded on the road right next to our driveway. So there he was when we came down, shirtless, in his shorts, with a hose. And every time a wall of fire approached to the east, he would poke the hose towards it. And then it would approach from the south, and he'd poke the hose towards it. And really, he did that for 3 hours, and by saving his life, he saved ours. And I know, just as we were talking before we came on and met everybody, you were remembering how for 45 minutes I was literally under my house. So I could see the fire systematically making its way through my living room and wiping out every childhood toy and memento and photograph, of course, in my bedroom. And then going on to my office where my next 3 books were in handwritten notes and reducing all of that to ash. And I suppose to some extent reducing my boyhood dreams of becoming a writer. And yet, I mean, to go back to where we began, I'm so happy you said that there is hope, because I was talking to somebody yesterday, another writer, young writer, who'd lost everything in the world in Malibu in a recent fire. And it suddenly struck me that at that time, it seems nothing but loss. But now, for me, this was half a lifetime ago. And with each passing season, I noticed more and more the doors it had opened. On the night itself, I was aware of the many opportunities it closed off. But subsequently, and all this time later, I see how often it liberated me to things I would have been much too shy to try otherwise. And one of the things that always amuses me in retrospect was, as you said, I was a journalist. And so when finally a fire truck got up to us and said we could go down into the town, it was safe. I went to a supermarket, I bought a toothbrush. I went to a friend's house, actually the very house in which I'm sitting now, to sleep on the floor. But before I slept on the floor, I asked my friend if I could use her computer, because my job in those long ago days was to be a columnist for Time magazine, and I used to write the back page essay, and I just had an eyewitness account of what was then the worst fire in Californian history. So I went to the computer and I wrote up an account of the day that I had just experienced. And because I'd already been spending time in Japan, I ended my piece with a little poem I'd picked up in Japan, which I think is now quite well known, but was less well known in 1990, from Masahide, who wrote, "My house burnt down. I can now see better the rising moon." So it struck me now, the very night I lost everything in the world, 2 hours after escaping the fire, something in me, wiser I think than I am, realized it wasn't just a loss, and it was impossible to assess loss and gain in the short term. I couldn't see the larger picture, but if nothing else, it would sharpen my priorities. And I thought about the fire a lot during the pandemic, because I think many of us suddenly noticed what I find, and the reason I go on retreat, which is, what do we really care about? What do we love, and what do we have to bring to the ICU? And suddenly it came into sharp relief, I think, for many of us during the pandemic. And on that evening, suddenly, well, my wife-to-be is still here. My favorite books are still here. Van Morrison's songs are still in my head. My mother is alive. There's so much I haven't lost, and it's really a lot of the essential stuff I haven't lost. So I lost everything in the world, but I saw that not everything was lost.
Yeah, yeah. And it introduced you to the Hermitage, and within a year from the Hermitage, you made a phone call to, I think, propose to Hiroko,
Yeah.
and and you got married, and that completely changed your life. Where you were living, you now acquired 2 children, 2 lovely children. By the way, your daughter Sachiko, I think, was not well. Is she? She's now all grown up, but she's doing better.
She's doing very well. Thank you. It's so kind of you to ask. Yes. And I think so. In retrospect, again, it's so interesting and to me unexpected that going to the beloved solitude on which I thrive, the main thing I would learn is that solitude is only a means to community and compassion, and therefore the main effect it would have on me is moving me to get married, which maybe I wouldn't have done otherwise. And then the other beautiful thing it taught me, which I had intuited from Thoreau and Marcus Aurelius and every wise soul through history, is that actually living in a 2-room apartment in the middle of nowhere, no car, no cell phone, no anything, was a much greater luxury than living in a big house cluttered with things. Far fewer distractions, far fewer things to lose, and much greater contentment. And so going to the Hermitage and spending time in that little cell reminded me that luxury is not about how much you have, but how much you don't need. And I had everything I needed in that cell. And then when I moved to Japan, as you say, there were two small kids and my wife to be and I in a very, very tiny apartment, and not a care in the world, in the best sense.
So perhaps we could talk about silence a little bit. What is silence for you, and why are you seeking silence?
So, yes, I say early on in the book, and everybody here knows this very well because you go on retreat and you meditate, that the silence I'm describing, which I found in every monastery and convent in any order across the planet, is not just an absence of noise. It's a positive, thrumming presence, wide awake and alive. And it's almost as if these are transparent panes of glass that have been created by years of prayer or meditation. Um, it's it's not the silence that you would find in a mountaintop, and it's not the silence you would find just in a quiet forest. It's something active and galvanizing. And I suppose the reason actually I wrote the book now is I've never seen our nation and our world as divided as it is now. And I thought, well, silence is a place on the far side of our divisions. I think what cuts us up are either our words or our beliefs and ideologies. I know better than you, John. I believe this and you believe that, and there's no way we can come to peace. But when, let's say, that 60 of us here today are asked to join in a moment of silence, I think, again, our divisions dissolve. We awaken from the illusion of separateness. And we're joined in our deepest part, which is not the part of the analytical mind cutting the world into pieces, but it's in the part of um, our heart or our humanity, which is much more prone to see another person as an example of ourselves. I just, or an extension of ourselves. I just last week read The Zen of Therapy by Mark Epstein, in which he quotes the Dalai Lama saying, selflessness is seeing things as they are, which is a beautiful formulation I'd never heard before. But in my experience, in silence, if you're liberated from yourself and little Pico is left down on the highway, suddenly you're not thinking in terms of distinctions. You're not thinking at all, actually. Um, I feel I'm seeing things much more clearly, and seeing things much more clearly means that um, there's no me and you, really. There's no this and that. I'm freed of that part of my mind. And what another of the happy surprises for me of going on retreat there is that when I walk along the monastery road, I'll sometimes pass another retreatant, and we'll stop and we'll talk for 2 or 3 minutes. And somehow I will feel quickly as if that person's a really trusted and respected friend. And we're not joined by the fact that we have the same ideology, that we went to the same college, that we're in the same job or living in the same town. We're joined by what you rightly called longing. We're joined by the fact we're seeking out silence. And so I always feel we're joined in our deepest part, and I'm connected to that person in a way I fear I wouldn't be connected to the person I pass on Fifth Avenue in New York City or even here in the street in Santa Barbara. So that's a beautiful thing, that you're not beginning to think of the things that separate you.
And it sounds like you experience silence, and then you bring it back into your daily life. How do you, how does that work? How
Yeah, well, let me step back a minute, because when I when left New York City to move to Japan, and quickly realized that I was too immature to spend time in a temple, I was lucky enough to meet a great Zen master, Keido Fukushima Roshi, and he, seeing this bewildered kid, walking backwards through the streets of Kyoto, said to me, "Remember, the whole point of our practice is not in the going away from the world, but in the coming back." And later I heard in Kyoto, a classic Zen saying, it's relatively easy to sit still in the meditation hall. The challenge is to sit still in the middle of the crowded and tumultuous world. So I can't claim to have advanced on any of those fronts. But you're right that having the door opened to silence and a world beyond the social self uh, reminds me, when I go back into my regular life, which is where I spend most of my time, not to take it too seriously, not to take myself too seriously, and to recall this isn't the whole of the picture or the end of the story. So, of course, if I go on retreat for 3 days, 1.5 days after I return, I'm again cursing the guy who cuts me off on the freeway, and I'm fretting over my tax returns, and I'm thinking, why did my editor ask me to, write that whole piece yet again? I'm back in my usual agitated, fretful self, but I can't be as attached to it as I was before, and I know that, in some ways it's an illusion. And so, like all of us, I try to implement various practices as a result of my time with the monks. I mean, some people are surprised. As a journalist who travels a lot, I've never used a cell phone, but I feel I have a lot of enough data and distraction in my life. I think, as I say, moving to a two-room apartment in the middle of nowhere was a was a an effect of seeing how little I needed, and that a quiet life would be more fruitful than a rushing life. I try to take walks twice a day, and that's the main part of my writing practice. I try to spend an hour sitting quietly in the sun, just reading a book, and I come back from that hour a much deeper, more intimate, and nuanced version of myself than the one who went outside. I try to practice a little bit of Lectio Divina. The monks take in scripture every day as they're eating. I don't take in scripture, but I try to read something that speaks to the deepest part of me, whether it's Shunryu Suzuki or Thomas Merton or Meister Eckhart. And then every evening I used to be waiting for my wife to come back from work. And I would never know if it was going to be 20 minutes or 70 minutes. So I just tried to kill the time. And then I'd scroll online or I'd watch Japanese TV where there's nothing, as you know, much to see. And then I thought, instead of killing the time, why don't I restore it? So I just turned off the lights and I listened to music. And I found I was so much fresher when I heard her key in the door, and I slept so much better, and I was so much less jangled when I woke up the other day, just by disabling my senses and in some ways giving myself a break. And so all of us have many such practices, and many we might come to them through the normal run of things. But I think watching the monks and experiencing that very positive silence helped me to see how much I didn't need, and probably helped me to see what I did need deep down.
And Cyprian, who was he was the Father Superior for a time. Uh, he talked about kenosis. So could you tell us about kenosis, and is that the right pronunciation? Kenosis.
No, I think you got it absolutely right. And I think it's the principle that every Zen practitioner knows inside out. It's the emptying out of self. And that notion that if you're emptied of yourself, you can be filled with something much richer and deeper than yourself. And I suppose another way of putting it is, I first went there because I thought monks know how to live. And that was what I could learn from them. And the longer I stayed, I realized, seeing their selflessness, that really they would be teaching me how to love. And that's why I made the commitment to marry, as I might not have done otherwise. And then I saw that really, like any monastic in any tradition with a skull on the desk or some equivalent, they were learning how to die. And then I saw they were actually learning the hardest thing of all, which is to tend to the dying, to be there, absolutely present, while all your brothers and friends, monastic brothers, and the people around you are dying. And so, yeah, I suppose kenosis, another way to put it would be to die to yourself. Um, and it will come back to me what I was going to say about kenosis and yes, it does come back, has come back to me, that seeing everything is impermanent, but seeing something that to some degree is less mortal than we are makes mortality a lot less scary. So I'm remembering how 4 years after I began staying at the Hermitage, my father suddenly went into the hospital and died 2 weeks later. So I'm an only child. My mother was grieving. I had to look after her and organize the memorial and write the obituary and receive the condolence calls and inform friends and family across the globe. Very, very busy time. But I realized one day, when my mother was well taken care of, the the only way I could respond to death was drive 3.5 hours up the coast, just sit on a bench along the monastery road above the ocean, watch the bees among the lavender, see the rabbits in the undergrowth, look at the vast, unbroken Pacific Ocean, hear the bells tolling. And somehow that put death in perspective. Not that any of those things are immortal, but they're a lot more immortal than we are. So when I think of kenosis as an emptying of self, which means a filling up of oneself with something else, you're also probably being filled up with something much more enduring and important than you are.
Yeah,
And
isn't that the basic, Buddhist notion of when you forget the self, and then the 10,000 things are revealed, right? Because that's how the self is expressed. Only in the 10,000, in the blue jays, in the lavender, in the bees, in the broad, wide ocean, right? And that's a
yes.
really beautiful image, and it's really nice in your writing. You come back to that again and again, where you talk about silence, and then you come back to realization, essentially, of that silence.
Yes. No, thank you. That's beautifully put, and the 10,000 things are probably much more important than you are. Or we are.
Certainly, yeah, certainly we're part of the 10,000 things, right? Very important parts of the 10,000 things. One thing, I'd love to hear you talk about some of the people there. Cyprian, really a very interesting character, if I may call him that. He was a monk, and he was brought in to lead the monastery. But he was allowed also to live up in Santa Cruz, I guess, and he sat zazen, and he played the guitar, and he taught, I don't know, seminars at the Tassajara. He was a very, very interesting guy. Could you tell us about him?
Yes, I mean, a professional musician. So he was literally touring the world as a musician before he became a monk. And he loves travel. So he was spending his time in Jakarta and Beirut and India and Singapore, all kinds of exciting places. Brilliant. He's constantly writing books. He composes his own music. He's burning with life. He runs 7 hours a day. One of the more talented people I've met, who essentially gave all of that up to be the prior, which is the thankless job in that community, probably in most communities, because the monks, I think, undertake that life in order to try to meditate, to pray, to be close to God, to serve others. But the prior spends all his time dealing with insurance companies and lawyers and construction people who are telling him he needs $5 million to build an evacuation road, and working with laborers around the community who are fighting each other. I mean, it's really, really hard job. And so it's very moving to see him give up the exhilarating and endlessly stimulating life he had chosen for all this. And as you say, a typically broad minded soul. I remember when I would go and have a dinner with him in his cell, he has on the wall a picture of Jesus in the lotus position, which is pretty much where he's at. Again, dissolving every kind of distinction. I think he also had a poster of On the Road, Kerouac's book, because that was essential to him. And really, a surprisingly large number of the monks are like that. I mean, there are scholars, artists, engineers, chemists. There's another one who is living pretty much full time in Santa Cruz now. And so, as you said, it's strict, but I think the Vatican, over 1,000 years, has got quite good at the sort of parental obligation of keeping a close eye on its monks and either giving them more freedom or reining them in. So when this hermitage began in 1958, in the early years, it was really strict. I think they could only receive 4 letters a year. They weren't allowed to see visitors, so they had to pray in a chapel separated from their guests. And as it is, their cells don't look out over the sea, so it's just the visitors who have this glorious view. And then the the people who oversee them in Italy felt that they were moving too far from humanity and that they had to be given much more freedom. So even though they live with restraints now that they have in some degree chosen, um, they always will tell me that they have a much looser life and a much easier life than Carthusians and others. But it strikes me, as I was talking about how they were being told to be brought back to humanity, I mean, that would be another way of describing why I go on retreat, which is to get away from society and closer to humanity. And, I feel most of us have a social self and a silent self. And I'm not very taken with my social self. And, we have to put on masks to go through the world and we have to play roles. And that's a fine necessity. But I don't want to be taken in by any of those. And I do want to be reminded of some deeper self or non self that is further from the expectations um, of the world.
You say something about how intimacy outside of the monastery, outside of the hermitage, is treacherous, but
Yes.
lack of intimacy inside the hermitage is just as bad, right? That intimacy is the very glue that brings the community together, right?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
Exactly. And that's why whenever I meet somebody along the road, as I say, I instantly feel very close to them because all our defenses are gone. It's the safest place I know and the most protected. And of course, in silence and in the cell, shadows and demons rear up as they do, when the Buddha was under meditating under the Bodhi tree, or when Jesus was in the wilderness. A lot of what they faced were devils coming out from within themselves, probably. But I would rather face those devils there than on the 101 freeway. And yes, one becomes intimate with everything, really. And we worry so much now about inappropriate relationships with other people, rightly, but I often worry about an inappropriate relation with myself, and there, one inappropriate relation with the world. And there, I think, I come to a much more intimate relation with the world. And it's so uncanny, as I described many times, when I step into the cell and I take a shower, I can feel, I think, the person who was there yesterday, or I can see the Kleenex that she's left on the kitchen counter with a lipstick smudge or whatever. And it's a startling thing to feel so close, in this case, to people you've never met, but to realize that you're joined by this common longing, to use the word you invoked.
You have this lovely reference to Cyprian, if I might read it. So, in the intimate quiet, I dare ask Cyprian, what's the best thing about being in the cloister? And he looks up to the ceiling and he says, nothing for a long time. And he says, sometimes, he begins, we can get really loud. And the monks are coming home from the north and from the south, and we all get together in the refectory for lunch. And he says, you miss your silence then, you said, about the monks getting very loud. And he says, no, not at all. I love that sound. I have all my brothers here laughing and talking, getting another glass of wine or some more dessert. This is the great reward for all the trials of Job. He's on fire with the thought of kenosis, the practice of emptying himself out completely. It's a really lovely reference, I think.
Thank you, John. I'm so glad you read that passage and noticed it. You're the first reader I'm aware of who registered it when it's the last page on the book, and it's pretty much the point of the whole book. Just last week, actually, I was reading a book in which a young Zen monk comes to an older monk, and he says, I think admirable friendship is half of the holy life. And in this case, the older monk says, no, you got it all wrong. Admirable friendship is the whole of the holy life. So that's what Cyprian was embodying and expressing there, that all their silence and contemplation and prayer is just a means to being better friends to one another and sharing in the, as you say, joyful fruits of community. And the monks are tremendously gregarious and down to earth. It's us retreatants who can get precious and holier and thou and up in the air, but these guys are grounded, and they've stripped away all pretensions about themselves, I suspect.
Yeah, you've expressed concerns about the survivability of not only the hermitage, but of a cloistered life, of a dedicated religious life.
And it's an interesting, especially in this community, it's an interesting notion to address, because there are so many communities, I think, like yours, where people gather for retreats and gather regularly to share wisdom. But I'm wondering if there is a difference between that and a place where people have given their lives to living behind the wall, as you put it. And yes, so in the hermitage that I've been visiting, New Camaldoli in Big Sur, when I first went there in 1991, there were 7 people who were oblates, which means that they're lay practitioners. They live in the world, but they make a promise to try and honor the principles they've gained in their monastery in the world. There were 7 of them then. There are 800 of them now. So, but at the same time, the number of actual full-time monks is down to single digits. And as in all monasteries and convents that I know, the only ones left are fairly elderly. And if a young monk feels this powerful calling and he goes there, but he sees that the only company he'll have will be monks in their 80s, suddenly even his calling is qualified, and perhaps he won't follow up on the life. So, I'm a perfect bad example because I love going on retreat there. And I'm gaining a lot of the fruits of their teachings through example. And yet, I and many people I know won't make that full-time commitment in the age of short attention spans. I used on YouTube to listen to the very wise and loving Father Thomas Keating, who was in the Snowmass Monastery near Aspen, radiated goodness. He didn't have to talk about love because he seemed to be living it. And he died a few years ago. And sadly, the whole monastery is closed down now. And the Catholic Church will get $150 million when that very choice property in Colorado is sold. But they and all the rest of us will be infinitely poorer. And
Yeah.
so I do worry about what will happen if these places leave us and the living example that they represent leaves us.
And yet they never asked for money. And I think a new monk came, a novice came, and he had a $3 million gift that he wanted to give them. And what did they tell him?
Don't. Don't. Think about it. You're too young. Practice discernment. Think where it'll be most useful. And then right after that, I said, the Buddha famously found that an excess of austerity was no better than an excess of indulgence. Giving up too much was as much as clutching, was bad as clutching too much. And I wrote that in the book. And when I sent the manuscript to one of the monks, he circled that. He said, I love this, the Buddha part. He said, yes, exactly. We are trying to practice exactly the same principle that the Buddha's story tells to all of us. I so appreciate it, John, that you read the book, I think, twice and listened to the audio, and you're picking up all these details that most people would never notice. So thank you.
Well, I love the audio. Not only is your voice just beautiful, but there's something that the audio gives that's more of a 3D experience. It's really interesting, and yeah, I loved Emily Wilson's Odyssey in the audio as well, read by Claire Danes. Highly recommend both of these audios. I'd like to just switch out a little bit and chat about the Dalai Lama, who you've known for more than 50 years.
Yes.
You are his guide when he comes to Japan. You've at times spent weeks together, all day long, and I would guess that you know him as well as many, many people. What tell us about your relationship with the Dalai Lama.
Yes, and I would just say, in honesty, I'm not his guide in Japan, but I'm lucky enough to follow him around by his
Ah,
side every day of his working days in Japan. So when His Holiness came into exile in 1959, my father, who was a philosopher and knew a lot about Buddhism, realized, as many people didn't, that this great treasure house of wisdom was available to the outside world for the first time in history. And so my father sailed all the way back from um, England to India and requested an audience with the Dalai Lama. And the Dalai Lama, of course, suddenly arriving in the larger world, was excited to meet anyone. And so my father was one of the first people he met, and he has an extraordinary memory, so he never has forgotten that. And in fact, he sent through my father a photograph of himself when he was 4 years old, already on the lion throne in Lhasa, to me, age 3, back in Oxford, England. And I had it on my desk. And I remember, every now and then I was feeling sorry for myself. Oh, I'm going to boarding school. I'm 6,000 miles from my parents. Life is hard. And then I see a picture of a 4-year-old who's already ruling 6 million people and in charge of 14 million Buddhists. And I was put in perspective. I have nothing to feel sorry for myself about. And so my father first took me up to meet the Dalai Lama in his home in Dharamsala when I was a teenager. And then, as you say, for a little over 50 years, I've had the rare privilege of being very close to him. And actually, when I was talking just now about the living example that monastics offer to us, I was thinking of the Dalai Lama, who, although his life is in the midst of the world, and because it's in the midst of the world, is such a living example. I mean, if the Dalai Lama was a semi-secular person who had a retreat center in Banff, Canada, he would have a lot of wisdom to impart. But I feel the fact that he's led a monastic life to some degree behind, within his cloister all these years makes him an even more powerful representative to us of a life that could be ours.
You write that you struck by his realism. He's very scientific, isn't he, in his approach to even life. And he says of the Buddhists, they're fantastic at being doctors of the mind, but the Catholics are really good at feeding people, right? On being at the front lines of taking care of people.
Exactly. I mean, again, he's humble and open and minded enough to tell his Tibetan monks, you need to learn from your Catholic brothers and sisters about tending to the oppressed, going to Africa and helping the people without enough food, helping the unhoused in the streets. As you say, he feels that the Tibetans have a bit of an edge, perhaps in meditation, because they've been living in such seclusion behind the highest mountains on the planet for so long, but that they conversely have something to learn. And I would also say he's a realist because he's been ruler of his people since the age of 4 and political ruler since the age of 15. So he's never been in a position to entertain wishy-washy notions or romantic ideas or hopes. He has to, navigate the realist of geopolitical worlds. And when I travel with him, and this may have come up when we spoke before, John, the sentence I always remember him saying is that whenever he's addressing a large audience, at the end, somebody will put up a hand and she'll say, what if you really, really, really trying to reverse climate change and it doesn't seem to be working? Or what if you long to bring peace to the Middle East and you feel you're making no headway? Or what if you wish you could have a better relationship with your spouse, but it doesn't seem to be going that way? And the Dalai Lama always looks at the questioner with great warmth and sympathy, like an uncle, and says, wrong dream. In other words, I think his feeling is you have to be really realistic and rigorous and analytical in setting your expectations. And if you're hoping to reverse climate change tomorrow or bring peace to the Middle East next week, you're always going to be disappointed. And so the way I've sometimes formulated that for myself in a silly way is, if you're hoping to marry Brad Pitt, it ain't going to happen. But if you're hoping to find graces in your partner that Brad Pitt would envy, that will happen this afternoon. I mean, it's up to you to be able to find that. But that's what I think what I mean about realism. He has no interest in the wishy-washy.
You in the book, you asked him a couple of really, I thought, great questions. You said, what's his greatest achievement in life? And you also asked, what's the saddest thing he's ever experienced? Could you share those with us?
Yes. I mean, I'll never forget this. I was having a series of discussions with him. Every afternoon I would go to his house in Dharamsala and we'd talk about a lot of things. This is 1996. And so one day I asked him, what's the saddest moment in your life? And instantly he was lost to me and he was looking out the window to the misty Congo Valley below. And he was at the border in 1959 when finally he made it into freedom in exile. And a large number of Kampa horsemen had served as bodyguards and protected him all the way to the border till he could be seen into safety. And then they turned around to ride back into Tibet, probably to their death.
Death, yeah.
And 37 years later, he could remember that moment and remember, well, really the selfless sacrifice they had made and the fate that was awaiting them. And yes, for the greatest achievement, because when I saw him in 1996, 2 Hollywood movies were being made of him. He was on the cover of a magazine. He was really the toast of the world. He'd already been awarded the Nobel Prize. So to many people, it would seem that he'd achieved a lot in the world. And he just remembered this moment in Soweto, the township outside Johannesburg, when he'd been confronted with people leading very difficult lives. And he asked to see a typical family, and he was shown into a not very privileged house. And there was one person there, he said, who had absolutely no confidence. He said, I'm born in this apartheid system, I'm denied education, I can't vote, there's nothing I can do, I might as well not be living. And the Dalai Lama talked to him for an hour. And the Dalai Lama told me, well, I think at the end of that hour, I had imparted some confidence. And he said, that was a day when I felt I'd really achieved something. Just one person. And he always, in that way too, is so practical. I saw him the day after he'd won the Nobel Prize. He was here in Newport Beach, California. And again, most Tibetans and people who care about Tibet were celebrating. But he wasn't at all. He said, all I can do is just take one step at a time. I hope in the right direction, and as and when enough people join me, finally there'll be a transformation. As Dr. King said, the moral arc leads to justice, but in the very, very long term. And because he always has the larger picture and the longer term in mind, that's a very tonic and liberating kind of realism. He never expects shortcuts or epiphanies tomorrow.
And he doesn't talk a lot about nirvana or awakening or any of these spiritual achievements.
No, well, exactly. I think spiritual achievement might be a phrase he recoils from. There were times when he's in front of large, large audiences in the West, and somebody will say, "Excuse me, Your Holiness, how does one attain enlightenment?" And tears will form in his eyes. I mean, you can see his heart breaking. And occasionally, when pushed, he says, "If I have 10,000 more lifetimes, maybe I will slowly get a little closer to what is ever is meant by by enlightenment." But yes, so his concern is not with nirvana because that's way over there. And I know in Zen practice, nirvana and samsara are sometimes the same thing, but in his world, um, he's just in the entirely human world, trying to do his best.
Yeah. In you talked about passing the candle. That's almost an expression within monasticism, and we were talking about, the change towards secular life. What happens on his passing? What's going to happen to the whole Tibetan structure of monks and nuns and the like?
Such an essential question. The question everybody is asking, and nobody has the answer to. He first addressed that in 1969 because he knows the stakes are very urgent. So he's been thinking about it for more than 50 years now. My assumption, which is completely an ignorant one, has been that he will depute somebody while he's alive, and he will designate a spiritual successor who perhaps will not carry the title of the Dalai Lama, but he will tell his Tibetan community, please listen to him, he speaks with my voice, and he is your spiritual leader. Because, of course, there's quite a large group of young lamas who have grown up in exile, often tutored by him, right next to him, who are extremely well equipped to be spiritual teachers. The challenge is that, of course, there's no Tibetan alive who has his experience in the world and his experience of dealing with Mao Zedong and every political leader, and that's pretty much irreplaceable. So it's a very, very hard challenge. I was going to say a minute ago, it almost takes us back to the fire, because the other thing I notice is that whenever people bring terrible sorrows to him, and it reminds me of the story of, I think, the Buddha and the mustard seed, but whenever that happens, his answer is, please take a wider perspective, please, in time and in space. And I think it's one of those statements of his that is disarmingly simple. But if you've just lost a house in a fire, say, in some ways taking the wider perspective, think of all the other people who are in an equally difficult state, and the fact that everybody is encountering something akin to losing everything. I don't know. It might be quite a good medicine. I don't know if we've ever spoken about how I went up to a fishing village in Tohoku soon with the Dalai Lama, soon after the terrible tsunami of 2011 swept away overnight 18,500 people to their deaths, and there was almost nothing left there. But when he arrived in his car, hundreds of people, mostly women, were gathered along the side of the road. They were so touched and warmed that this great dignitary had come to visit them. And he got right out of his car and he blessed people and he held their heads against his, and he offered, strong words of wisdom, and please look forwards at what you can change, not backwards to what you've lost, and please try to complete the projects that those you have lost would have wanted to do. Please be worthy of them. The best response to loss is to try to be worthy of the person that you've lost, and please rebuild your community the way your country did so heroically after 1945. So he gave all these stirring words of inspiration. But when he turned around, because we were standing right next to him, we could see that there were tears in his eyes. And it was very touching, because I thought he has all the wisdom that is needed to give to these people who are in desperate straits. But he has the humanity to feel their grief and to know again that there's no separateness really.
That's beautiful. Yeah. I'd like to ask you about somebody who you have called, without a doubt, the kindest, deepest, wisest person I've ever met, except for the Dalai Lama, of course, which is a special situation.
Yes,
Can you do a reading on Leonard Cohen?
yes, gladly.
Cohen?
It's a bit of a long reading, but
Sure.
this is a Zen community. We all want to dissolve, the old Zen monk in red bobble cap and thin glasses tells me with a wry chuckle as he greets me in the chill mountains behind Los Angeles, 300 miles south of Big Sur, where I've come at the end of December. We all need the experience of forgetting who we are. I think that's what love is, forgetting who you are. He flashes a crooked grin. Forgetting who you are is such a delicious experience, and so frightening. Bells toll through the dark, and I hear the sound of clappers. The stooped figure leads me up an unlit path between the trees to the meditation hall. The smell of incense everywhere, as 30 students dressed in black take their seats in rows on either side of a central altar. Not a cough or tremor. When they break, they hasten out into the night and walk in single file between tall pines on the icy ground. Upon their return to the sound of a pounding drum, they recite the Heart Sutra at lightning speed, its syllables in Japan a mere fusillade of sounds. For 7 days and 7 nights, they'll mostly be sitting in this hall, stepping out occasionally for visits to an outhouse and meals taken swiftly and in silence, mopping the leftovers with tea. In his small cabin, all friends are welcome, says the mat outside. My gracious host, twice the age of most of his comrades, assures me there's nothing special about this training. This cluster of cabins in the high, dark mountains behind LA used to be a Boy Scout camp, though now, in his mordant telling, it's a penal colony. Every word and action in the emptiness, decisive as a slash of calligraphy across blank pages. Towards the end of the next day, my guide to Zen practice leads me up again through great shafts of light between the conifers. The air vibrates with the intensity of silence. We step into the room where the head of the community, a tiny 88-year-old Japanese man in heavy, layered robes, is sipping something strong. I came to America to die, the abbot announces. I arrived when I was young, 55. I was fit as a jumping shrimp. He's never bothered to learn much English. Words are needless scratches on the clarity of what lies beyond. I look at the monk who's brought me here. I think of myself at 17 in the little hotel in Bombay, listening over and over to his songs about Marianne and Suzanne, the one who told you when he came he was a stranger. Always in command, on point. And now on this dark mountain, he carries himself like an anonymous grunt, scrubbing floors, cooking for the abbot, driving the old man to the doctor. He has no interest in holy men or golden sentences, he says. He knows how to play that game a little bit himself. This is simply the most helpful, the most imaginative response to the predicament of life that he has found. Well, here you find answers, I suggest to Leonard Cohen shortly before I leave. Here you find freedom from answers, he replies, in the grave and gravelly baritone beloved by many. Freedom from question. A landscape without doubt. The songs, I realize as I drive down from his mountain, are often about suffering, panic and jealousy and pain. He never pretends he isn't defeated by love and himself and all the ways in which he isn't what he hopes to be. But they're never simply sad. They speak for a struggle in which words like happiness and sadness are beside the point. The only thing you can believe in, he keeps reminding us, is a reality you can't comprehend.
Yeah, that's great. And 20 years, more than 20 years of friendship before he passed.
Yes. Yeah.
And one of the last, you've got a very moving anecdote about one of the last times you went to visit him. Could you tell us about that?
Yes, and actually, I think you may be referring to the first time I visited him in his home, but yes, I think I know the one you mean, because of course he was the most spellbinding writer I've ever met, the most articulate soul. He's a wizard with words. That's what made him such a great poet and songwriter. And I remember the first time I visited him in his home, which is a very modest duplex he shared with his daughter in a really rough part of Los Angeles. We had lunch together, and he spoke captivatingly about the life of the spirit and literature and politics and his journeys to Cuba and Greece and everything else. He'd had one of the richest of lives in his 60s. And then at the end of the lunch, he picked up two folding chairs and he carried them out to his tiny garden, looking out on a quiet residential street in front of a tiny bed of flowers. So I sat down next to him. Nothing. More nothing. He didn't say a word. And so finally I thought, oh, this is a gentle hint. And so I said to him, I'm sorry, you must be busy. I should leave you. And he looked at me and said, please don't go. And so it goes back to what we were saying before. He realized that the deepest thing he could share with anybody was not his words, but his silence. That was a true sign of friendship and of trust and of kinship. And I think many people who knew him would go to his house and just sit in silence with him. And of course, his wise Japanese teacher had actually given him the name Jikan, which in this context means the silence between two thoughts, and probably felt that the best thing that this man of beautiful words could attain would be silence. And I think his favorite song among his songs, and certainly mine, is If It Be Your Will, because there is that man of constant command who's always set on making his own destiny and who calls himself Field Commander Cohen, completely giving up everything, surrendering. If it be your will, I shall be silent. I am spoken for. Um, Amazing thing. And talk about sacrifice. He had a lot to sacrifice when he became a monk for 5.5 years. He'd completely erased whatever the world thought of as Leonard Cohen, and then he was ready to give up even his words.
Mhm. And he was so dedicated to his teacher. You have a reference of him taking care of his teacher when he died.
Yes, and then he was with his teacher the many times his teacher was in hospital and close to death. I believe the teacher died at 107 or 108, and I was with Leonard the day before the teacher passed away. And Leonard, elegant Leonard in his suit and in his impeccable man of taste, was a man who chose to be in the hospital ward looking after his teacher in his final hours. And he said, that's the point of the practice, cleaning an old man's diapers when he isn't able to do so, taking a person in need to the bathroom. That's what all of this is about. He'd been practicing Zen for 40 years at that point. And he'd realized that the compassion was the whole point of it.
It made me think of an EQ poem. Let me just very short poem I read. My dying teacher could not wipe himself, unlike you disciples who use bamboo. I cleaned his lovely ass with my bare hands. That's EQ Sojun. You
Unbelievable. What a
know?
connection. Oh,
Yeah,
I wish Leonard had heard that. Yeah, he would have been
yeah,
amen and hallelujah. Oh, what a poem. Huh.
yeah,
It's a
yeah.
beautiful thing because it just reminds us these things lie outside time and outside space. IQ, what, 500 years ago, Leonard Cohen in modern Los Angeles, and it's the same thing that never gets old.
Well, that's that intimacy and the intimacy in silence and the intimacy in of flame, right? Of both fire and stillness, and how they come together and go apart and come together and go apart. It's moving across that frontier between activity and stillness. That's called life, right? That's
And
the, that's the important thing.
bringing it back into the confused and conflicted world. I was just yeah.
Please, no.
No, my thought has evaded me, but it will come back much too quickly, I fear. So
Well, it gets back to this sense of passion and uh, just the passion for realizing this very life. you know, and it is helpful to have quiet, and it is helpful to it's helpful to re-enter the world. So we need to do both, it seems, and I think that's what your book was about for me, Pico, and I really appreciate it. It's just a really lovely book. Thank you.
Thank you. It was about the beauty of retreat, and therefore, one of the beauties of retreat is the realization that retreat is not the point and is a means to more practical daily ends. And I remembered what I was going to say just when I was saying that none of this is new. If you hear IQ delivering the word for word the same things as Leonard Cohen, in this book I also have Fu Schrader from San Francisco Zen Center, who's become a great friend of mine and a real source of wisdom. And she is in charge of 150, or was in charge of 150 students at the Green Gulch Center in Marin. And I would ask her, how do you deal with the fact that values and priorities are changing all the time, and people concerned about social justice and racial issues and the pandemic and all of it? And she said, none of this is news. It's all happened 100 times before. And therefore, answers have been given by the Buddha or by the Stoics or by whoever it is. Whatever we're facing now is not something people have not faced before. And I think one of the reasons that I've gained so much from my Camaldolese friends is that their order and their discipline is 1,000 years old. So it has faced and understood and withstood, like my Japanese neighbors, any amount of plague and warfare and fire and everything that the world can bring us. And it's a discipline I trust.
That's wonderful. I'd like to take a few questions. Marie Howe is on. I don't know, Marie, if you're free, if you can unmute. Also, Peter Hershock. Good to see you, Peter. It's good to see all of you, of course. Peter was one of our early Pacific Zen luminaries, a scholar from Hawaii.
I think I had the great blessing of sitting next to Peter at a dinner once in Palo Alto, and Marie is one of my absolute heroines whom I haven't seen for 10 years. So thank you for PZI for bringing us into the same screen.
Yeah, it's a great pleasure to be able to hear you, Pico. I remember that night in Palo Alto very, very clearly.
So what a delight and surprise to see you. And we talked about surfing, I think, among other things.
Among other things, yes.
Very good. Thank you all for coming. This has just been so lovely, Pico. You're just so the work you do is just tremendous. I just really love it, and love to read your books and listen to your talks. And please come back again with your next book.
Thank you.
What are you working on right now?
I'm just completing a book essentially on the last seasons of my mother's life, framed around Shakespeare. Shakespeare's been a great friend of mine for many years, but I haven't talked to him for quite a while. So I thought at my advanced age, the best company I could keep in our little apartment in Japan, other than my wife and family and ping pong friends, would be Shakespeare. So as an excuse to spend time with him. So I'm writing about, yes, I suppose impermanence again, preparing for death, and what light Shakespeare sheds on all of that. I wish I were writing almost about Emily Dickinson, whom I think is maybe even more unfathomable than Shakespeare, but it's Shakespeare for now.
Good. Well, we look forward to reading it. So thank you again, and good night all. Thank you for coming. And if you want to become a patron of the Pacific Zen Luminary series, we could benefit that. And we love to pay our artists. We love to pay our writers. So thank you all for coming.